Welcome. Can you hear me, everyone? Yes, I guess so. Great. So here we are with our next speaker. It's Professor Liam Delaney. He is the head of the Department of Psychological and Behavioural Science Department at the London School of Economics, where he researches ethical foundations and trustworthiness of behavioural public policy. In this webinar, he will introduce the FORGOOD framework, which includes 7 ethical considerations when nudging behavior. Welcome, and I hand over to you, Liam.
Great. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Louisa?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great.
And the presentation also works.
Excellent. It's really great to be here with you all virtually today. I spoke at the sibling conference, the Warwick Economics Summit, about 10 years ago, and Dan Ariely spoke before me, and I sort of, in attempting to look exciting and dynamic, I tried to sort of rush onto the stage afterwards, after Dan's talk, with a very upbeat message, but I didn't realize there was a step, and I hit the step and then I fell right in front of the podium, and I looked up and there was about 300 shocked students looking at me like I just invaded the stage or something, but I managed to recover. But I guess one advantage of the online format, at least you don't have to navigate stages. So what I'm going to talk about today is an ethics framework we built. We have a website that has the framework on it, some slides, case studies, that type of thing. So that's really going to be the main thing, to really introduce people to this debate around the ethics, or discussion around the ethics of different types of behavioural interventions, and hope it's useful. So we'll talk a little bit about motivation, and then introduce the framework, and talk about a few case studies, but I'll largely leave that open for Q&A. So in terms of the motivation, I've been, like many people here, I've been working on this area for a long time. I've written a history of the different ways in which economics and psychology and policy have interacted together. It has been doing so for a very long time, but it's certainly clear since the development of things like the Behavioural Insights team, the publication of Nudge back in the late 2000s, and then increasingly global interest in this area. It's becoming mainstreamed. You're seeing a professionalization of the area, the development of a whole range of different public bodies, units, programs across universities. And I think there is a need for something that really makes ethics salient, and without losing the importance of the different types of issues. And we saw with MINDSPACE very effectively brought together a range of different literatures to make behavioural change work salient in areas of public policy where it hadn't been salient before, and really had a huge impact in UK policy across many different dimensions. Ultimately, the development of Behavioural Insights team has had implications all over the world, as you've seen groups form with similar sort of mandates. And I think some of these frameworks, whether it's MINDSPACE, EAST, or some of the more elaborated frameworks across health psychology, like the behavioural change wheel and so on, they really help you in thinking through all the different ways in which people's behaviour is shaped. And particularly if you come from an economics or a law background where you've traditionally taught in terms of financial incentives, it can be a very useful prompt for thinking more laterally about all the different ways that behaviour can be changed. I mean, I would say also, though, I mean, it does move you in a particular direction. Firstly, that that behaviour needs to be changed. These things tend to prime you to think about behaviour change as opposed to whether you should change behaviour. It would also tend to make you think about the ways in which you could change behaviour rather than the ethics of those particular means. Now, many of the people working in these areas, of course, have all sorts of other ways they think about ethics. But I do think it does make very salient early in the process how to change behaviour as opposed to those wider aspects. Salience is obviously important. Bandwidth is obviously important. So MINDSPACE was very effective. But even there, those of you who work in health psychology and other literatures might think it's too simple. But those who work in policy will know that it can often be very difficult to capture attention, to make something salient in what are often short policy windows. I think Behavioural Insights team in particular have had quite a lot of success with EAST, which is an attempt to condense a lot of literature in social psychology, cognitive psychology, behavioural economics, down to a framework that's usable in the sort of time and attention windows you're dealing with in public policy. So you know, most of you are familiar with this. If you want to encourage a particular type of behavior, getting people to sign up to pensions, those types of things, make it easy, attractive, social and timely. And on the other hand, we're having this big discussion about the role of behavioral science, or the role of behavioral influence in potentially influencing people in other ways, in dark ways. The extent to which the type of things that we study could be used for manipulative purposes, the extent to which they could be used for harmful purposes, and then all the various shades of grey that exist between those areas. And I mean, we talk about dark nudges, and you know, the Dark Patterns website I really recommend, and we're increasingly seeing very detailed literature on disinformation, very detailed literature on dark aspects of product design, and a detailed literature on things like dark nudging, so user interfaces that have been carefully crafted to trick users into doing things designed to exploit cognitive biases and covertly influence customer behaviors. So I think that's the first thing, and it's not something that will be new to all of you, but that, of course, behavioral influence can be used in all sorts of different ways, and the development of behavioral science as a mainstreamed, professionalized area should be as much about thinking carefully about ethical issues as it is developing the techniques. And increasingly, as I said, this literature is becoming more specialized. So we can think of things like dark nudging, which I guess you could think of as making bad choices easy, attractive, social, and timely. So making things easier for people to do that on reflection they may wish they hadn't done. Or we can think of things like sludging, of which there's an increasing literature, making it difficult for people to express preferences that would be likely good for them in some normative sense. And we could spend a lot of time discussing these distinctions. There's a lot of philosophical issues, a lot of ethical issues, pragmatic issues. And me and my colleague, Leonard Laddis, have spent a lot of time doing reviews on these areas and trying to come up with something that would be usable in public policy. And obviously, we've had this debate around nudging, very big philosophical debate about whether it's too libertarian, whether we should have more hard mandated interventions in areas like climate change, or whether it's too interventionist, whether there should be more emphasis on responsibility of people to navigate these decisions themselves. And I've certainly sat in rooms for days on end where people talk about the philosophical issues on these. So what we're really trying to do with this framework is come up with a way of condensing a lot of the literature on pragmatic ethics into something that would be usable in professional and policy contexts, while not overly, doing this a disservice to the underlying philosophical ideas. And that's the big question that we have, is taking a moment, taking periods at the start of large-scale projects to reflect on the ethical dimensions of them. So how can we differentiate between manipulative, unethical uses of behavioral science, and how do we embed that into training and so on? And what we were essentially trying to do is come up with a framework, a mnemonic to make this salient at the point at which people are doing these types of things. So as an academic, I cringe a bit at acronyms, but we made a very conscious decision with this that we wanted it to be read, which is something you don't always do when you're writing academic articles. We really wrote this explicitly to get it used in public policy. So a pragmatic guide for policymakers who may not have the time to go through all of the philosophical literature. For the moment, we think of it as almost a pre-mortem tool to help people navigate the different types of ethical challenges that are there, allow people to go through case studies, rather than being a very prescriptive guide. So in terms of the type of things you might think about if you were thinking about the ethics of nudging or the ethics of behavioral intervention more broadly, so Thaler had previously said that nudging should be transparent, which I think is a good principle. It's something I always say in my policy workshops. If you're doing something that the public wouldn't like if they knew about it, you have to ask yourself, should you be doing it, particularly if you're working in a public policy context? And there's a very fascinating literature emerging on transparency in the context of behavioral science. And I'm one of the people behind the launching of the Global Association for Applied Behavioral Science. And in our code of conduct, transparency is one very important part. Thaler also believes it should be as easy as possible to opt out of the nudge, preferably with as little as one mouse click. And I think that's an interesting one to discuss. That would be particularly if you are coming at it from a libertarian paternalistic point of view, where you're trying to shape people's behavior to do things that would be good as they see it themselves. I mean, obviously that may have a different interpretation if you're looking at something like vaccines, or if you're looking at something like any good that would have an externality. But in general, it's not a bad principle for some of the more libertarian paternal interventions. And the third thing that Tyler says is there must be some reason to nudge people based on their welfare, so that particularly if policymakers are doing something that's influencing people's choices, that there should be a reason for doing it. So nudge for good. So Tyler used to sign copies of Nudge with that phrase, nudge for good. And I guess we take that as a starting point. And for those who've seen the blog post, I was reviewing this literature for a long time and reading dozens and dozens of papers, and you get lost quite rapidly. I think sometimes some of this literature is fascinating, but it makes it difficult to apply because there's so many things going on. And we attempted to bring it down into a set of principles. So this is the framework. So openness, transparency. So that's the first one, openness. So the transparency, that people know what you're doing, issues around consent, the salience of the interventions, and then the issue of whether you're manipulating people. Goals. So when you're pre-planning these sort of work or looking at problems from a behavioral perspective, what are the actual welfare goals you're trying to achieve? Respect, and this covers a whole range of things. Autonomy, people's dignity, which is a very complicated one because there can be often aspects of public policy that have, that are almost independent of incentives or questions of effectiveness, or even questions of broader questions of procedure. These are just, do people have a preference for how they're spoken about, included, all of these different types of things. Options. So a very interesting ethical issue from a behavioral science perspective is the extent to which behavioral nudging can sometimes be used as an alternative to harder mandated options. And there's a lot of debate and a lot of sometimes heated debate about that. I believe it is something worth taking into account if you're working in this area. And you can see in some areas there's clearly an incentive for strong vested interests to propose softer solutions in areas like climate change. And we've had debates about that in the context of COVID as well. Opinions. So partly an ethical issue, partly a broader issue about public acceptability, including the acceptability for dissenting minorities. And then we move up to delegation, which is a fascinating one as the area is professionalizing. So issues like conflicts of interest, expertise, and this will be relevant to many of you listening today. I mean, if you're using a phrase like behavioral scientist, what does that mean? What criteria should you meet before you can call yourself a scientist? And most professions have had those debates. I mean, and they resolve them in different sort of ways, but it's something that we really need to do more on in our areas. But delegation would also cover things like if, for example, if you're doing interventions in developing countries, for example, to what extent need they be developed in participation with local communities? More generally, what's the role of the mix of expertise? Issues like epistemic trespass, if you're doing, for example, public health interventions, what sort of expertise do you need? And so on. And then questions of fairness, which would cover traditional issues of distribution, and then broader issues. So I haven't got time to give you a huge account of how we managed to bring this down into a framework, but you'll probably guess what we call the framework. So we made this down to FORGOOD, which was a set of 7 principles that we believe act as a pre-mortem tool to go through the ethical issues that are existent on any particular public policy involving behavioral effects. So we would envisage, for example, behavioral insights teams, people working on particular policies going through this prior to the rollout of any project. So, I mean, further discussion, really interesting if you have other things that you think pop out that we've missed, what you think such a framework could be used for, whether you think there needs to be something harder in the regulation of behavioral science, or whether you don't need something like this is also very interesting. I mean, we've tried to fit an awful lot into 7 principles, and you might think some of these things, while they fit into some of the boxes, might have their own. Something like privacy, for example, in some of the frameworks we've looked at, gets its own category. And I think that's really important when we're looking at big data type or the evolution of what we're seeing in mega studies and so on. We've got very large randomized trials with lots of data. and then regulatory structures around nudgers, that type of thing. Again, do we need it? I mean, we do think it would be very useful in terms of providing a structure for that, but open to discussion on those ones. And then in terms of the dangers, I mean, I guess it does simplify things a bit, and you don't want to reduce ethics down to a checklist. So we are thinking about those sort of issues as well. In terms of where we would like to use an ethics framework, it would be not so much with calculating acceptability index. Could be possible, happy to discuss it, but it's a difficult one. But certainly in terms of a pre-mortem, but also in terms of encouraging standards more generally across the area. And as I said, the proliferation of behavioural insights teams across the world, or behavioural science groups across the world, we really have that in mind as the primary use when we're thinking about these things. There are alternatives in the literature. I really recommend Christine Clavian's really fascinating paper on the ethics of behavioural interventions, which focuses on this concept of shared preferences and consent over means, which really looks at behavioural intervention by states as being something where they're, in essence, being granted some power by the population to do some of these things with their consent. And there's fascinating concepts developed in that paper. And then there's a bunch of other really interesting papers in that area, and Sunstein's own work is really fascinating on that one. I've momentarily just lost control of my computer, so I'm just going to stop sharing at this point, and I'll throw it open for questions. Sorry about that. I just had a momentary lapse with the screen share. So let me just. Yeah. Louisa, has that come up again? Has it?
Yes, it's working again.
Okay, great. Apologies to the audience. Sorry, my computer just seemed to momentarily stall. So I'll just do a couple of case studies, and then we'll be happy to take questions. So I think if you take something like simplified disclosure, the classic example being moving from the pyramid to the plate. I mean, you look through all of these and you don't see much, right? It kind of looks like, although I've workshopped this with lots of students and people come up with different types of things, but it looks like it could be very good on areas like fairness. It's certainly transparent for the most part, and there's no obvious issues of respect. They tend to be very popular interventions designed by experts. When you move into things like Save More Tomorrow, which many of you are familiar with, again, has a lot of benefits in terms of fairness. It has a lot of useful properties in terms of it increases the savings of people that are on low income, has a lot of gender, ethnicity benefits. You might think that it is from a transparency perspective, the way Save More Tomorrow works basically means that you're exploiting an existing bias that people have for their benefit. So there could be some discussions there about the openness of it. And whether it's substituting for mandatory pension policies is another thing people have debated. But in general, it looks pretty good from an ethical perspective. When you get into things like opt-out organ donation, you get into very interesting issues around people's opinions, the goals that are there, respect for different minority views that are in these areas. Things like password choice. So looking at whether to nudge people in a very hard way to set hard password defaults. And another really interesting one actually was the charity sector. So it has been regulated against the types of nudging that it can do in terms of street level pressure for people to sign up, sharing of information, those types of things. So again, these are interventions that could be quite effective in saving people's lives, but might fall afoul of issues around the popularity of using these sort of techniques, but also openness, transparency, those types of things. And then when you move into areas where you've had problems in the past with the ethics behavior interventions, so things like bogus pipelines, so telling people, fill out this psychometric questionnaire and it'll influence what job strategy we advise for you. If that's not actually being done in the way described. So in this case, no matter what they filled into the psychometric test, it advised them to just search for more jobs, basically. So that falls afoul of, or at least it's certainly questionable from the point of view of openness, respect for the people involved, opinions, and so on. And we've seen a lot of stuff like that in the job sanctioning literature, where a lot of interventions were done in ways that the person was compelled to participate, and if not, would get an employment sanction, those sort of things. Labeling NHS prescriptions is one we've just written a paper on. So looking at messages like funded by the UK taxpayer. So again, you kind of look at it and you think that sounds like a good idea, but if you look at it in more depth, can depend on how people interpret the word taxpayer. There's whole categories that would interpret that as basically saying you're a burden to the taxpayer, as opposed to being part of the category of taxpayer. You know, there's a lot of really interesting issues when you go and look at these types of things from a social exchange point of view and from a messaging point of view. So I'm just going to leave it there. So basically what we're hoping that people do is go through all the different types of interventions that you're thinking about or studying and look at them from the point of view of ethics. That doesn't mean that there would be sort of a hard trapdoor for each of these projects, but it does mean that you could think through some of these ethical dimensions, and there may be ways in which something that looks potentially ethically tricky could be turned into something that's an advantage. And particularly when we're talking about scaling up some of these large-scale interventions, there should be a lot of food for thought in there. So thank you very much, and apologies for the slight hiccup with the IT there.
No problem. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. We have already a few questions, and maybe the first one would be if this framework can also be applied to sludge.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So Leo, my colleague, has already been writing on sludge, and we're doing a lot of work on administrative burden in our research group. The answer is yes, but Leo is doing a lot more specifically on the kind of the ethical issues with administrative burden. And there's a lot of literature. I mean, there's even, which I think is both fortunate and unfortunate, there's already a lot of debate about what sludge is.
Mm-hmm.
And something similar happened with nudge. Like, firstly, these are words that Thaler and Sunstein used to sort of help message the broader ideas that we're having, and now basically people are doing a lot of work just trying to define them as scientific concepts. So some people would say, like, sludge by definition is unethical, right? Because it's, you know, if you think of it, it's stopping people from enacting a preference that they would otherwise want to enact. But you could think of some definitions of sludge where it would be totally ethical, like you're trying to slow people down from making a rash decision, or it's a, you know, in the traditional literature on queuing, it's an alternative allocation mechanism that allow people to express their preference through a non-monetary means. So in some sense, it could even be fairer to allocate some goods by at least some notion of how long people are willing to fill out some paperwork to get it. So in answer to your question, I think you could go through any sort of policy that was using complexity to enact some sort of policy preference, and you could go through all those dimensions and you come up with interesting ideas, I think, but it may make more sense to develop a separate one. I mean, the other one we're thinking about is whether this framework is more suited to public policy than to the, let's say, behavioural insights teams emerging in things like banks. Like, I get a lot of emails from people working in utility agencies and things like that who are developing these sort of ideas, and they wanted, you know what I mean, they want it to be done consistent with their company ethos and so on. And I think I feel most at home with this framework when I'm talking to insights teams working in government, for government. You know what I mean? It feels like it's naturally a home for that. And I feel it's a bit more of a stretch when I'm talking to private companies. And I think almost we need something more like an elaborated code of practice for folks that are doing it sector by sector, if you know what I mean. And I think that's where we're going. Like, truthfully, I think you'll see very detailed statements from large financial firms as to what their sort of code of conduct is for using these types of things as we move on.
Okay, great. Thank you. There is one question regarding fairness and justice. What's the definition of these two words as one? Is it separate? Is it combined together? How is it in this framework?
Yeah, I mean, we make a few different distinctions in the paper. I mean, fairness, I think we're thinking of it from quite traditional welfare distributional contexts, and it's just shifting it onto a more behavioural domain. In terms of justice, can be, I think, a broader concept. I mean, I think also the concept of dignity and autonomy in these frameworks is a little more complicated than just fairness as well, in the sense that it can be getting at non-material or non-distributional aspects that are complicated. But so in answer to the question, fairness, we are elaborating around the lines of, you know, distributional and welfare distributional. I'm just trying to think. I mean, justice is a broader concept. Truthfully, we don't spend a lot of time making the distinction in the paper, but it obviously has a broader sense to it than, although, I mean, you could, I'm just trying to think, as I was answering the question, I was just thinking of John Rawls's famous book, Justice is Fairness. So I don't, as I said, but you can see, you can get quite lost in the philosophical distinctions between them. We don't make too much of a distinction between them in the paper. We do make a distinction between fairness and the broader concept of dignity. And I think dignity is a very, very difficult one, because, you know, you could have no implication at all for the type of interventions you use with regard to effectiveness. It may not even have implications for how you roll them out. It could be literally things like how it's discussed, who's consulted, you know, those sort of things, which turn out to be very important to a lot of people, but don't manifest themselves in obvious sort of things that we would normally track when we're looking at these types of studies. So as I said, in the paper, we do distinguish quite clearly between fairness from the point of view of distribution, and then dignity, autonomy, those types of things. But not really, I don't think there's anything in the paper that makes a very fine-grained distinction between fairness and justice, even, but it would be philosophically a worthwhile thing to do.
Okay. Good, thank you. And so now we can move to another question. Do you think there should be a central regulatory body to uphold ethical standards in behavioral interventions?
It's a really interesting question. You need to think about the history of how a lot of this developed. So you've got an emergence of something that is transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary. Now you've got home disciplines like economics and psychology, and then you've got subdisciplines of psychology like health psychology, who will have their own kind of standards boards, or even subdivisions of psychology like clinical psychology that will have professional standards, you know, licenses for practicing and so on. Where we are at the moment is in a sort of fragmentation where you've got a lot of different things happening, things that are developing in different areas and so on. You are seeing a few things. So the Behavioral Science and Policy Association being one example, and then the Global Association for Behavioral Science, which are there as sort of professional membership groups that are there to at least promote good practice. Journals themselves and professional associations would promote good practice. You're not yet seeing anything like what the questioner has asked in terms of like a central body, and that's probably not feasible to the extent that, you know, people are working in different industries, they're working in different sectors. What you might see is the development of professional associations such that, you know, using the term behavioral scientist would imply that you're adhering to at least some notional code of conduct. But it's a really interesting one in terms of, you know, how does it work in other areas? Obviously, in areas like advertising, PR, they will have their own standards board. Sometimes, you know, they work really well, sometimes they don't. And, you know, some of the, there's some movement in the literature like open science frameworks and things like that. But, you know, so in essence, there's been a big movement to reform practice in the scientific aspect of this. But, you know, we need to think also about practitioner base. Like, how do you actually promote good practice there? So let me finish answering the question by saying there will be a lot more on this in the next 5 years. Whether it gets to a stage where you've got some sort of global international agency that makes sort of binding statements about behavioral interventions, I don't know if we're going there. But I think we are definitely going somewhere where, you know, ethics will be taught straight out. I think actually people will bear the weight of the phrase scientist a bit more. as we're moving in from this. That because, you know what I mean, if you're doing science-based practice, like if you're a chemist, or, you know what I mean, it implies a certain amount of training and a certain amount of adherence to a set of principles. And I think that's where we're going with some of these literatures.
Okay, yeah, it's a very interesting future perspective we are facing. So we have one more question. You say you wrote it to get it read. What do you believe you compromised by writing it in this way? Were there any important findings from your research that you weren't able to contrive into a nice framework?
It's a good question. I think what you lose from anything and is that, like, if you even take a question like even just take dignity, or take something like demarcation, which is like, how do you set up, you know, a well-constituted behavioral group? I mean, you could spend honestly so long discussing those sort of things. So when I'm speaking or when I'm involved in projects, you feel, you know what I mean, are you scratching the surface on this? On the other hand, you are trying to get something together that would make it possible to have an influence on a whole set of things. Like, you know, I'm currently on the Irish government's COVID group, and I mean, truthfully, you know, we used to have on the behavioural team, we used to have it sellotaped on our desk. I even have it on a mug. We really did want to make it salient, and we really did want to take ownership of the fact that these were behavioural interventions that were affecting large groups of people, and we wanted it to be respectful, and we wanted it to be so we gain a lot from it. We lose, I think, that space that you have to really think it through. So I mean, we're obviously working on all sorts of subdivisions of this, and you know, today we have 40 minutes. I mean, I've done this session over whole days, so I do a full day in LSE on this topic with our exec students that are likely to go out, and that's brilliant. And I definitely never find they're bored at the end of the day, if you know what I mean. Yes. We don't run out of stuff to talk about. So I mean, that's the best way I can answer the question. The more time you have to reflect on these, but no, we didn't. We've not like taken out any big category or anything like that. It's an interesting one as to what's the optimal amount of attention to put on this. My one thing I would say, I think, to the extent that you get this stuff right and well elaborated at the start of any venture, that will help a lot when you're scaling, because some things that don't look important from a small scale trial become very important when you're doing it at a national or a regional level, and you get more competing interests, media attention, and then wider concerns. So yeah, probably not a perfect answer to the question, but that's it.
Yeah, thank you. We have someone who raised his hand. It's a colleague. I would therefore hand over the microphone. 1 minute. Let's see if this works.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Liam. I just wanted to add to the issue of ethics in terms of actual practice. There are Savicom units. If you were doing public service and kind of engagement, public policy kind of project, that kind of would like to backstop and see that you are following due processes, engaging with clients as ethically as enshrined within the code of practice of different governments. And then also you can also get certificates, like when you are doing a bill amendment, like a sponsored project or any other financier, they would require to see evidence of ethics and compliance, a certificate of stuff. And there are reputable groups like Citi in the US that does some certifications. I just wanted to stress that there are some measures.
That's a very good point. Yep. And of course, there's also very detailed research ethics frameworks in most universities. So, and I agree with you in terms of areas like privacy, areas like conflicts of interest. Most governments will have various types of public service obligations that would cover some of the things that are here. I think that the more we do this sort of work, though, the more that we're stretching the ability of some of those frameworks to handle some of those issues in terms of they're slightly different projects. So, you know, doing large-scale randomized trials, for example, you know, it stretches a bit the types of ethical frameworks that a lot of governments have developed for general engagement with university researchers and things like that. I would say you see examples coming through the literature, you know, with a reasonable degree of frequency of things that could have done with a bit more time on the ethical side. So I think partly it's also making it salient. I mean, I do think the framework is another attempt to really get people that are trained to think about rapid deployment of RCTs with you know, very clean research designs, to spend as much time thinking on those issues. But yeah, your point's really good one.
Yes, thank you very much for this question and this pointing out this thought. I think that was all when it comes to questions. If nobody has anything else to add or to question, then I would say thank you very much to you, Liam, for your time and the presentation. And yeah, we will have now half an hour break.